I never met Sarah, and given her suicide, I will never get the chance. Nonetheless, I thought that the story of her death would interest many of you. The following is a description based on the information I gathered from her files and comments by a colleague of mine. The following is a description based on the information I gathered from her files and comments by a colleague of mine. Sarah was a 22-year-old dark-haired woman that loved reading books and riding horses. She was an outpatient and was only interviewed 4 times, by 2 different analysts. Sarah was never under observation as she did not seem likely to commit suicide. Her case first came to our attention about 3 months ago, when first Sarah herself and afterwards her mother called the institute because of, as Sarah phrased it, strange dreams. Her mother called it paranoia and a return of Sarah's depression. One of Sarah's friends had recently committed suicide. He was a young man called Andrew, had tied rocks to his feet and jumped into a river. He subsequently drowned. Andrew left a note detailing that he had loved Sarah for many years and that his unrequited love had been the reason for his suicide. The letter ended with the phrase, "I cannot live without you. It is tearing my lungs and heart apart to be away from you." After the suicide, and particularly after being informed about the letter about a week after the suicide, Sarah fell into a deep depression which forced her to take a break from her university studies. The break and distance from her usual circle of friends aggravated her depression at first, but after a month she began to recover. It took about 4 months until Sarah had regained a stable mental state and continued her studies. About 9 months after Andrew's suicide, Sarah began to tell her mother about nightmares of drowning and about seeing Andrew's face in her dreams. At this point, she and her mother contacted the institution. The first interview resulted in a rather unclear report. The interviewer noted that a recent episode of stress was likely the cause of Sarah's vivid and traumatic dreams. He concluded that no further action was necessary as Sarah seemed likely to recover by herself. A month later, about 10 months after the suicide, Sarah's depression fully returned, and she again had to interrupt her studies. During a second interview, she reported seeing Andrew's face in reflective surfaces. Additionally, she described vivid nightmares of drowning, which would always end by Sarah seeing Andrew's body at the bottom of the river, his hands moving towards her and his face stretched into a smile. Sarah reported that she felt an intense pain, similar to water entering her lungs, during those dreams. Sarah received rather strong anti-stress and antidepressant medication. Her mother repeatedly phoned the institution after the second interview. Sarah's mother complained that her daughter slept more, rather than less, and that the intensity of the nightmare seemed to have increased, as Sarah would scream repeatedly during the night. The mother also reported that the medication seemed to have caused Sarah to lose control over her bladder while asleep. A second analyst was sent to Sarah about 11 months after Andrew's suicide and the onset of her depression. Sarah first refused to talk to him. She only relented after the promise that her medication would be changed. During the third interview, Sarah reported that her nightmares had become longer and very realistic. She fell asleep and immediately found herself standing on a bridge. She first saw Andrew in the water below her, atop the water and shouting, "I love you," at her. Then his cold fingers touched her feet and finally grabbed her legs. While Sarah fought to stay on the bridge, he was too heavy, or strong for her, and pulled her inside the water, where she would find herself being pulled deep to the ground, where Andrew, seemingly unaffected by the water, would try to embrace and kiss her. While trying to escape, Sarah felt her body weakening and an onset of panic, which, due to her dreamt inability to breathe, grew increasingly intense. Finally, the dream would end with Sarah, still pinned to the bottom of the river through Andrew's embrace, gasping for air. Sarah described a disturbingly realistic feeling of drowning, which included the increasing fear and panic, involuntarily gasping for air, the pain of water entering her body, and finally first the agony, and finally the relaxation that oxygen deprivation brings along. The analyst also noted that Sarah reported coughing water right after waking up. He concluded that this was likely either a panic-induced exaggeration or an excuse for her bedwetting. Her medication was changed to products known to cause dreamless sleep. 3 weeks after this interview, the same analyst was called for an emergency meeting at Sarah's house. At this fourth and final meeting, Sarah reported that she had seen Andrew for several days, alternatively standing outside her window and crouching in her wardrobe. The day of the last interview, she reported that she had not dreamt, rather she had woken up from a cold hand grabbing her arm while she was asleep. Upon waking up, Sarah saw Andrew, his body colored in a pale blue tone, standing above her body. She particularly remarked that Andrew had looked cheerful, almost happy. Sarah screamed after waking up. The illusion disappeared when her mother entered the room. The analyst suggested that Sarah should receive inpatient treatment, and suggested that a longer period of observation and therapy would be necessary to process the events. Sarah and her mother refused the offer on financial grounds. As an alternative, Sarah and her mother agreed to sleep in the same room until the situation improved. According to Sarah's mother, Sarah was very worried over the next days and moved as well as spoke, a lot during her sleep. Sarah reported waking up from feeling a cold hand pulling her arm, but as the visual hallucination did not reappear, she and her mother concluded that her condition had improved. 4 days after the last interview, on the anniversary of Andrew's suicide, Sarah's mother woke up from a wet mattress. She searched the house and found the front door open and her daughter missing. At that point, she called emergency services. 3 hours later, Sarah's body was found half a mile downstream of the very same bridge from which Andrew had jumped to his death. No suicide note was found.